I remember the moment like it was a broken film reel. I grabbed for the mashed potatoes and a white-hot twist tore through my lower right side so fast I thought my insides would fold out. I whispered for Dad, Mark, but the room kept moving like nothing was wrong, crystal glasses chiming, someone making a joke about work, Grandma Evelyn's voice booming about gratitude. I tried to stand taller, to carry myself through the toast like a man, but my legs gave. The world tilted, and begging felt like admitting weakness nobody in that house would tolerate. A little dramatic, aren't we? Tyler smirked from the other side of the table, and Denise rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might fall out of her head. People laughed the way people do when they want to cover the ugly with noise. I tried to tell them I needed air, that something was wrong, but the words came out thin and small because pain takes your voice, like it steals the edges off everything. My chest tightened, and I tasted bile on the back of my tongue. My vision fogged around the edges as if someone had rubbed Vaseline on my lenses. When Grandma said no one leaves the table during the toast, it felt like being locked in a glass box while the world kept performing around me. It wasn't just a rule, it was a clan's religion, a stubborn, loud insistence that appearances mattered more than human bodies. I could feel my heart pounding a frantic rhythm under my ribs as if it was trying to beat me out of the chair. "It's just nerves," someone offered, and that single sentence landed like an accusation that I was choosing drama to make them uncomfortable. I dropped to my knees under the table because my body finally refused the pretense. The Persian rug smelled faintly of old holidays and perfume, and then it tasted wrong when I puked on it. For a second, the table seemed endless, full of faces that had known me since I was a kid, faces that had watched me scrape my knees and held me when I cried. That night, those faces turned into judges, and their silence felt worse than any shout. Dad didn't reach for me. He stayed anchored to his chair like the captain who refuses to leave the ship, no matter how clear the hull is taking on water. Emma's eyes were the only honest thing on those faces. She had the look of someone holding a secret that could break everything if it was told, and suddenly she pushed her chair back like a small animal, deciding it would rather risk the kitchen floor than stay near the danger. Grandma grabbed at Emma's ankle, fingers like talons, and I watched my little sister freeze, lips trembling. The image of that grip, a grown woman preventing a child from saving her brother, is still sharp enough to make my teeth ache. People laughed after I threw up, an ugly, nervous sound that tried to make the moment less real. Uncle Greg called me dramatic, and someone else muttered that Mom had coached me to make a scene. Those words landed with a particular poison because they were familiar, like tracks worn into a carpet you step on without thinking. It wasn't just ignorance, it was a family code that punished need and rewarded stoicism. If you were weak, you were disposable. If you made trouble, you deserved to be hushed with jokes and eye rolls. Emma bit Grandma to get free, and the small, fierce thing she did is one of the reasons I'm alive. She crawled across the floor, nails scraping at knees, and reached the phone like it was a lifeboat. Her hands shook when she dialed 911. She whispered our address like it was sacred, like the whole world might collapse if she made a mistake. Dad screamed at her to hang up, a raw sound that tried to reclaim control, but Emma kept whispering. She kept going. I remember her small mouth telling the operator everything in a rush, so fast it was like she was trying to outrun the house's rules. When my body went into convulsions, the place fell quiet for a different reason, the sound of a few people finally understanding that the joke was over. Someone called 911 at last, a voice that could have been relief or guilt depending on how you wanted to measure it. I blacked out with Emma's little hand in mine and her whisper in my ear that Mom loved us and that she was sorry. That apology meant more than any sermon about respect or standing tall. It meant that a child had seen the truth and had chosen to act on it. The next minutes were a frantic, half-slow blur that I can still smell when I close my eyes, as if my brain keeps replaying the odor of antiseptic before the smell of blood. Emma bit Grandma hard enough to make her let go, and then she crawled like she was trying to disappear and reappear at the same time, moving toward the kitchen with a speed that didn't match her small frame. She had the phone clutched in both hands, whispering our address into the landline like it was a secret code that would open a door, while Dad screamed at her to hang up like the words themselves could erase what was happening. I remember thinking, in that sliver of lucidity, that his voice had the tone of someone used to telling people what to do and not used to being ignored. My body started to convulse in a way that felt like I was unhooking from myself, muscles pulling and releasing without permission, my vision folding into bright curtains that kept falling. It felt like being trapped inside a washing machine with no way to stop the spin cycle. I heard the clatter of forks and a single shoe hitting wood as someone moved too fast, and then someone said the word out loud, seizure. That tiny, ordinary word kicked off something in the room. It was like a light had been switched on, and people suddenly had to accept that this was more than an uncomfortable scene at a dinner table. Someone finally called 911. The tone in that person's voice was different, like guilt and relief braided together. Emma's warm hand was the last thing I held before everything snapped into black. It was small and hot and smelled faintly of candy and soap, and she squeezed my fingers like she was anchoring me to the world. She whispered, "I'm sorry, and Mom loves us," into my ear as if those sentences were talismans. Her breath was fast and fragile, and she sounded older than her years. That whisper has haunted me and comforted me in turns. A child saying sorry while the adults around her argued about decorum is the kind of image that changes you in a way you don't notice until later. When I woke up, the room smelled like medicine and machinery, and everything brightened slowly like the world was booting up. A surgeon with tired eyes sat across from Mom and me, and she said the words that calcified the night into proof. My appendix had ruptured and infection had started to spread into my abdominal cavity. She drew the timeline with a steady finger, explaining that if they had arrived even an hour later, the infection could have overwhelmed me, and that another hour might have been fatal. I remember the weight of that statement like a physical thing. It pressed down on my chest as heavy as the oxygen mask had been. Hearing the exact number of hours makes the family's stubbornness feel less like neglect and more like a slow knife. Dad paced the hospital corridor in that aimless way people do when they don't have a script for what comes next, repeating, "I didn't know," like a mantra that was supposed to make him innocent. I watched him from under the thin blanket and tried to make sense of his voice, which sounded smaller in that sterile light. It wasn't a confession and it wasn't a defense. It was a flat, worn-out refrain that meant he wanted to be believed without doing the hard thing of admitting he'd been wrong. The difference between saying you didn't know and saying you should have known is a line I can walk in my sleep now. Mom and Emma had acted and we were alive because of it, and that simple fact rewired the whole night into a different truth. The surgeon's team told Mom how fast sepsis can take hold and how lucky we were to have gotten a pulse line into me when they did. I could see the relief in Mom's face like a sudden light after a long blackout, but I also saw the rage that comes from realizing your children almost died because others put appearances over their bodies. That anger settled in my chest and warmed something that had been frozen by years of being told to swallow. Later, when people tried to make the night into a story about drama or manipulation, I could point to the surgeon's notes and the time stamps and Emma's whispered address and say the truth. The bravery in that kitchen wasn't fancy or loud. It was just a little girl doing the one thing she knew to do, and a mother who sprinted to a hospital with the kind of fear that sharpens you into action. The rest, Dad's pacing, his apologies that sounded like rehearsed lines, the family's excuses, became background noise to a fact that no amount of guilt or denial could erase. We were here because a child refused to be silenced, and because someone finally answered the phone. Donna Clark showed up like a small storm, briefcase in hand, and a face that had seen bad nights before, and the ER nurse said they'd reported us because adults in that house had stopped a child from getting help. I remember the way the folder clicked when she set it on my hospital tray, like a judge slamming a gavel. She pulled out her camera and photographed Emma's call log timestamp with hands that didn't tremble, and I felt the weight of proof sliding into place, as if the truth could finally be held between paper and pixels. She asked me what happened and I told her everything until my lungs burned, because telling it felt like dragging a trap out into the light. I said the things Dad had said at the table, the jokes that were knives in disguise, the exact words Aunt Denise and Tyler used to make me small. I spoke about how Grandma gripped Emma's ankle like a chain, about the way people smiled over my pain as if it were a scene they'd expected. I told her how my body keeled over, how my vision folded, and how Emma crawled to the kitchen like a soldier sent into a fire zone. Saying it out loud stripped some of the shame away and left only the facts. Emma sat close by and showed Donna the timestamp on her phone like she was holding up a witness. The numbers were simple, the kind of thing you can't argue with, a digital hand pointing to the exact moment help was asked for. Watching Donna tap the screen felt like watching a locksmith open a door that had been bricked shut for decades. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to relief, because the house had been so practiced at hiding things that we'd start to doubt our own memory, our own pain. The surgeon's notes were worse in a way that made me angry and careful at the same time. Peritonitis, visible infection during surgery, and words about preventable complications because of delay. She wrote like a person who had to stay precise to hold power against excuses. Reading it made the whole night lose its fairy tale gloss. There was nothing dramatic about it anymore, just cold medical truth that pointed straight at the cost of waiting. It was proof that the family's insistence on keeping up appearances almost killed me, and that truth is ugly and necessary. Mom and Cecilia Hart, the custody lawyer, started assembling medical records like they were building a fortress. They copied notes, photographed scars, kept every timestamp and test, and stitched the story together in a way that finally made people take up the fight with us. Mom moved through it with a kind of focus I hadn't seen before, a steady stare that didn't let panic rule the room. Cecilia talked like a hammer, precise, blunt, and unshaken by the family's outraged messages. Watching them work felt like watching people create light in a blackout. They told me a guardian ad litem, Henry Reynolds, would be assigned to represent what was best for Emma and me, and that felt like another adult finally stepping into a room that had been controlled by silence. The idea of someone neutral, someone whose job was to look at the children and say what they needed, felt almost luxurious after years of being told to keep quiet. Henry later asked questions that made me think about things I hadn't let myself name before, like whether my father's behavior was pattern or accident. Those questions hurt because they were blunt and true. As the evidence stacked up, Emma's call log, the surgeon's notes, the ER report, messages from Dad's relatives arranging the story, the weight of it became our armor. For the first time, I felt like we had something that would stop the old family script from swallowing us. Armor isn't glamorous. It's paperwork and timestamps and testimony, a slowing of breath when you realize you finally have a way to say no to being dismissed. It doesn't heal the scar in my belly or the old voices in my head, but it makes it harder for the same thing to happen again. I'm a man who grew up believing family was a fortress, but that night taught me fortresses can be prisons when pride matters more than life. The files and the records and the people who showed up to do the boring, necessary work changed the direction of our lives. They took a wild, messy night and made it into something the court could understand, something that could protect two kids who had been nearly silenced. That felt like justice in its rawest form, slow, dull, and finally, undeniably real. I came home and Mom turned her whole apartment into a recovery machine like someone rewiring a house to keep a life from slipping away, and I felt both grateful and small. She put a wedge pillow behind my back, taped a neat pill schedule to the fridge, and cleared a quiet corner with a lamp and a folding table so I could do schoolwork without shouting or noise. The living room smelled like boiled coffee and laundry soap, nothing fancy, just the smell of a woman who refuses to let chaos win. I watched her move through each task with a steady, surgical focus that made me believe we could put pieces back together, even if the edges stayed jagged. I started a journal the first night because words felt like a thing I could control when my body had been so out of control. I wrote down every memory I could pull from that night and from the little erasures Dad had practiced for years. The time he shrugged off urgent care advice when my stomach first hurt, the time Emma's cut was taped with a band-aid and told to toughen up. Writing felt like filing evidence in my head. I dated entries, I wrote times, and I kept sentences short because long ones blurred into the kind of denial my father loved. Sometimes I woke up at night and read those pages like a map back to sanity. Donna came by and walked through Mom's apartment like she was checking the locks on a vault. She took pictures, wrote notes, and nodded at things that made sense for a kid recovering from serious surgery, a stable place to rest, medication stored correctly, a plan for follow-up care. It wasn't glamour, it was a checklist. But Donna's checklist meant the court could see we weren't being reckless or dramatic. We were planning a recovery that a doctor could endorse. When she left, she handed me a business card and said quietly that this kind of documentation mattered. I folded that card into my wallet like a talisman. At school, Sophie Stone became a steady voice for Emma in a way that made Mom breathe easier at night. Sophie met with Emma in the counselor's little office and taught her ways to ground herself when memories hit like waves. They practiced breathing and the red card system so Emma could pause a supervised conversation if it got too much. Sophie also set protective measures so Grandma Evelyn couldn't just appear and take Emma off to a place she shouldn't be. Those steps felt simple but crucial. Fences around a small life someone had almost crushed with pride and rules. The case grew a spine of documentation, and every piece piled up like bricks that would keep other hands from tearing the house down again. Surgeon letters that described peritonitis and visible infection, school notes that matched my entries about recurring stomach pain, Emma's 911 timestamp that was a digital fingerprint, and my own journal pages that laid out a pattern instead of a single bad night. Cecilia, the custody lawyer, said courts respond to timelines and records, not moral appeals. That stung because it meant you had to prove harm in a language built for bureaucracy, but it also felt like building an honest case in a world that lends weight to paper. I made audio notes during supervised visits and during the quiet hours when Dad would call and try to arrange narratives for witnesses. I recorded what he said when he tried to coax me into blaming Mom. It felt ugly to trap words like that, but the recordings cut through the family script that wanted to wrap everything in excuses. Detective Rowan told me that consistent, dated entries and proof make it hard for people to rewrite history. Hearing that, I felt something tighten in my chest and then loosen like a knot beginning to come undone. Proof doesn't heal everything, but it stops a new lie from taking place. Some nights Mom would sit on the couch and cry in a low sound that looked like surrender, and then she would get up and check my meds like a nurse on a ship. And I understood that endurance sometimes just looked like doing the little things over and over. Emma started sleeping better with a nightlight, and we ate dinner at the small table with the pills lined up like soldiers. The daily routine became a shield: school, therapy, wound checks, and careful visits. It wasn't dramatic or satisfying in the way the family wanted drama, but it was steady, and steady won more battles than theatrics ever did. Living in that makeshift recovery zone taught me patience and the ugly truth that love sometimes looks like detailed lists and doctor appointments. It taught me that the defense against being dismissed is boring and thorough, and that armor can be as simple as a time-stamped call log and a stack of medical notes. I still hate thinking about how close my life came to ending because of pride and stubbornness. But I sleep better knowing the record exists and that Mom built a small fortress around us, made of papers, people, and a will so fierce it wouldn't let us be quietly erased. They turned the anger outward like it was a public spectacle, and I felt smaller with every new message that popped up on my phone. Group texts came first, whole paragraphs of accusation, like a pylon where everyone gets to throw the first stone and call it honor. They accused us of lying, said Mom was trying to ruin the family, and even claimed the rug was the real casualty of Thanksgiving. Grandma wrote that we had turned on the family, words that are supposed to wound because they come wrapped in history. I read them and felt the old shame stir, that trained reflex to take blame because it's easier than fighting. Then a cousin slid into my messages with screenshots that made my blood run cold. The same group chat rehearsing what to say if anyone asked about the night. They typed responses like actors memorizing lines, planning to call Emma unreliable and to say I'd made a scene. Seeing those screenshots felt like a confirmation of everything we'd feared, that the family story had been plotted, not improvised. It is an ugly kind of planning, the moral equivalent of setting furniture to block a door so nobody bothers to rescue the person inside. I kept that screenshot and sent copies to Mom and Cecilia because rehearsed lies need to be shown for what they are. Visits under supervision were supposed to be controlled and safe, but they were also tests where Dad tried to push his script into my mouth. During one of those supervised visits, I kept my phone on my lap and recorded covertly because I had a bad sense from him, and it turned out to be right. He grabbed my wrist like he always had when he wanted to yank someone back into line, and his voice got low and insistent. He told me I had been coached by Mom, that Emma had been coached, that we were making up a story. The audio captured him saying the words over and over, a litany meant to wear me down. Hearing his voice recorded felt strange and necessary. It was proof that pressure hadn't been subtle or casual. After the recording, Cecilia asked for the file and Detective Rowan advised having an IT check Emma's phone, partly because kids' phones sometimes hold more truth than adults want. The IT specialist found a family tracker app installed on Emma's phone, and the account was tied to Dad's credentials. The app showed location pings and message access that made it clear Dad had been watching Emma in real time, tracking where she went and reading, at least potentially, her messages. That discovery was a kind of betrayal that cut differently than words. It was a calculated decision to keep tabs, to own movement and privacy. It wasn't protection, it was surveillance. We quietly added that IT report to the pile of documents already stacking into something big enough to be noticed. Audio of Dad coercing me, screenshots of the family planning their story, the surgeon's notes about peritonitis, Emma's 911 timestamp, the ER report, and my journal entries. Each piece on its own could be dismissed or spun. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to gaslight into nothing. Evidence is a slow kind of fury. It accumulates like rain until the dam has to break or be acknowledged. I liked the metaphor because it suggested pressure, something piling up until it demanded action. The messages kept coming, bitter and performative, people calling Mom names she'd worn before in private. I saved everything. I photographed the texts, I backed them up, and I added them to the folder Cecilia used for court. Each screenshot of a rehearsed line felt like another nail they drove into their own story. I thought about the way public opinion can be turned with words because people like tidy villains and heroes. Our truth wasn't tidy, and that scared them, so they tried to tidy it by making us look like fabricators. Aunt Denise and Uncle Greg showed up at a supervised visit once and tried to charm the monitor, asking questions that had nothing to do with custody and everything to do with guilt. The monitor recorded the visit and the questions sounded rehearsed. The list of attempts to discredit us was long enough to make a person dizzy: texts, surveillance apps, rehearsed alibis, and attempts at witness shaping. All that friction would become part of the court record, and it felt like both a relief and a shame. Relief because truth would be seen. Shame because family had chosen shameful tactics instead of owning that a child had been in danger. In private, Mom held Emma and told her over and over that they had done the right thing. Emma learned the difference between loyalty and danger. She learned that sometimes you love someone by leaving them alone when they act like they're right but they're not. That lesson is ugly and valuable. I thought about Dad in the hallway of the courthouse later, face pale and mouths thin, muttering, "I didn't know" again. The evidence didn't care about the mantra. It only cared about timestamps, screenshots, and recordings that refused to let a family rewrite a near-fatal night into a neat morality play. In the end, truth wasn't loud. It was documented, and documentation became the weapon we needed to survive. Hector Reynolds came by with that quiet look people get when they're trying not to scare a scared kid, and I felt a small relief because his questions were steady, not sharp. He sat on the edge of the bed and asked things that made me think in tiny slices, like the difference between what happened before I reached for the potatoes and what happened after Grandma said no one leaves. I told him the moments in pieces so he could stitch them together without feeling the whole thing all at once. He asked if I felt pressured by Dad, if I ever had to pretend to be okay because adults demanded it. Saying it out loud felt dangerous and freeing at the same time. Detective Rowan arrived with a recorder and a clipboard like some kind of calm thunder, and he made me go through the timeline minute by minute until the memory stopped flaring and became a tape you could play back. I told him when the pain hit, when I first whispered to Dad, when Grandma refused to let me go, and when Emma crawled to the kitchen. He asked for details I had been ashamed of, like the sound of forks falling or the color of the rug after I threw up. Speaking into that recorder felt like laying stones on a path, so someone else could follow and see how close I'd come to being gone. The surgeon sat across from us with a stack of photos that I couldn't look at for long but that I also needed to see, like proof that my body had been through something real. The photos were clinical and brutal: open tissue, inflammation, the blackened edges of infection. She handed us a typed statement that said in clear, cold language that the delay was negligent and could have been life-threatening. Those words are ugly because they are legal and precise, but they cut through excuses. I remember clenching my jaw as if that would keep the image from falling out of my head, and Mom putting a hand on my shoulder like she was holding down a storm. Sophie Stone rehearsed Emma for court with the patience of someone who teaches kids how to breathe through broken things, and watching them practice grounding exercises felt both tender and strange. Sophie taught Emma how to concentrate on 5 things in the room, how to count breaths, and how to use a red card if she needed a pause during testimony. The red card was a small square of plastic that gave Emma permission to stop, and seeing her clutch it made me think about the power of small safety nets. Sophie also coached us on how to answer questions honestly and without getting pulled into family drama by vague accusations. We practiced until my answers felt plain and solid. Meanwhile, the legal side piled on rules for Dad like a list he couldn't blend into charm: psychological evaluation, parenting classes, and supervised visitation. It felt like the court was trying to remake him into someone who could be around us without repeating the night that almost killed me. I didn't know if therapy would change pride or entitlement, but it was something that put a boundary between us and the old pattern. I heard the words mandatory evaluation and pictured him sitting in a quiet room, forced to recognize the damage he'd done, whether he chose to or not. Violation reports started arriving like thuds against a locked door whenever Grandma Evelyn or others tried to cross lines. Grandma tried to pick Emma up from school once, hands quick and certain as if old habits were a higher law than court orders, and the security guard stopped her and filed a report. Aunt Linda cornered us in the visitation center parking lot one day and tried to argue custody like a performance, and someone from supervised visits recorded the whole thing. Those moments felt like the family testing the fences, pushing to see if the rules would splinter when they pressed hard. They didn't. The fences held because people had been careful about documenting every attempt. Preparing for court felt like learning to breathe underwater: slow, methodical, and utterly necessary if you didn't want to choke when you finally rose to the surface. We rehearsed testimony in the same measured way Sophie taught Emma to breathe: short sentences, factual language, no theatrics. Henry Reynolds, the guardian ad litem, sat with us and helped shape what we would say so the judge would hear a clear, undramatic story about what had happened rather than a messy family fight. Detective Rowan reviewed the timeline with me again and told me not to let witnesses bully me during cross-examination. That thought made my stomach flip, but I listened and practiced staying calm. It wasn't easy to prepare to stand in a room and tell people how your family almost killed you with etiquette and stubbornness. And some nights I lay awake thinking about Dad pacing the hospital repeating, "I didn't know." But there was a new muscle in me now, a small, wired toughness that came from filing things, from naming the pattern, and from learning that paperwork and steady testimony could save a life. The court might be a cold place, but it was also a place where truth could be organized and protected. I practiced speaking into that cold space until my voice sounded like the facts I'd been collecting, clear, slow, and impossible to collapse back into a single, easy lie. The courtroom was smaller than I'd pictured, wood panels and fluorescent lights making everything feel older and meaner than it should, and I sat there thinking how weird it was to have your life judged in such a place. The judge looked tired in a way that made me want to be brief and clean with my words so I wouldn't waste his patience. Dad's lawyer stood up like a man delivering bad news and called our story manipulation, saying Mom had coached Emma and me for money, like that was an explanation that fixed anything. His voice was polished and practiced, the kind that tries to make the ugly seem normal by wrapping it in legal language. Cecilia Hart answered like a woman who refuses to be distracted by performance. She presented a medical timeline that was a tight, steady knife. She laid out when my pain started, how long it took before Dad even acknowledged it, the minute the appendix ruptured, and the way the infection moved through my belly. The surgeon's photos and the typed statement, words like preventable, negligent delay, and peritonitis weren't dramatic, but they were brutal in their clarity. Medical terms don't make people feel guilt the way a face can, but they do a brutal kind of truth-telling. Facts that strip excuses of their soft edges. Emma's testimony came next, and I watched her from the edge of the stand like she was twice her age and tiny at once. She told them, in a voice that trembled and held steady at the same time, that she had crawled to the phone and whispered our address, that Grandma grabbed her ankle to stop her, and that she bit Grandma to break free. The courtroom smelled like old paper and coffee, and I could see a few people in the back shifting at what a child had to say about grown adults protecting the story instead of a child. Emma's words were simple and sharp. They weren't trying to hurt anyone, they were just telling what happened. When it was my turn, I felt the air thin, like being in a deep pool and reaching for the surface. I played the recording I'd made during a supervised visit where Dad grabbed my wrist and tried to make me say Mom had coached us. Hearing his voice back in that room felt like being handed the script he'd been trying to stick on me. The recording caught the pressure in his tone, the repetitions, the way he tried to shape a story that would clear him. After the recording, I read from my journal about thinking I was going to die on Grandma's rug, about the bile and the convulsions, about the shame of vomiting on family tradition and still being punished for it. My words were short, honest, and they landed like small stones. Dad's lawyer tried to make the judge see us as dramatic kids and a bitter mother, but Cecilia kept coming back to the hard things. The photos, the surgeon's statement, the 911 timestamp on Emma's call, and the group chat screenshots showing the family rehearsing their lines. It was a stack of small, stubborn proofs that didn't need to shout. The IT report about the family tracker app on Emma's phone sat there like a quiet betrayal surveillance presented as care. The judge read each piece and turned the pages like someone making sure a machine would not be fooled by polished words. You could feel the tension like a wire that might snap at any moment, but the court operated in small, safe motions. The judge asked questions that made everyone answer in plain terms. When did the pain start? Who refused to let a child get help? What did the surgeon say about the delay? Those plain questions cut through the fanfare because they forced facts into a place where performance couldn't hide them. I watched Dad's face change from color to pale as the surgeon's words were read aloud. He mouthed, "I didn't know," into his hand like a prayer that didn't match the reports. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was flat and final in a way that I had imagined 100 different ways. He granted primary physical custody to Mom and ordered supervised visitation for Dad on a strict timeline. He banned Grandma Evelyn from visits and school pickup and required Dad to complete a psychological evaluation and parenting classes, and to pay for therapy for Emma and me. Hearing those orders felt like the sound of a lock clicking shut on a door we needed kept closed. The judge explained he was acting to protect the children based on the medical evidence and the testimony showing a pattern, not a single mistake. The family at the back of the room murmured and blamed like they always had, but the papers in the judge's hands were louder than their voices. Cecilia told us the orders were immediate and that we should keep copies of every violation, every text, every attempt to skirt the rules. It felt like a strange, new comfort to have adults in suits make rules that meant safety. I left the courtroom with Emma holding my hand, clutching her red card in her pocket like a small talisman. We had won more than a ruling. We had real protection that would stand when pride and tradition tried to step in and undo it. Walking out, I thought about how the system works in its slow, boring way. Facts listed, rights protected, and a tired judge reading the cold truth of a surgeon's report. It wasn't the dramatic victory you see in movies, but it was better, precise, enforceable, and real. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the paperwork and the people who had helped us had built something that would keep us alive if the family tried to claim their old rules again. That was ugly and beautiful at once. Ugly because it took this much harm to get there, and beautiful because the law had been a place where truth could finally be arranged into shelter. The judge's ruling hit like a clean, sharp sound that made everything else quieter. Mom got primary physical custody, Dad was limited to supervised visits twice a month for 6 months, and Grandma Evelyn was banned from school grounds and visits. The paper felt like a fence built around us, not revenge, not grand justice, just rules meant to keep 2 kids from being put back into a dangerous script. I stood in that courtroom and felt both relief and a strange kind of grief, because the order proved what we already knew. Sometimes family loyalty is a weapon, and law becomes the antidote. Dad had to do therapy and parenting classes, and he was ordered to pay for our therapy too. The judge said it wasn't a punishment for spite. It was a safety measure based on evidence and testimony. Hearing that made me want to believe people can change when forced to look at themselves, but it also made me suspicious in the slow way survivors learn that compliance doesn't equal understanding. I kept thinking about how easy it used to be in that family to call someone dramatic and move on, and how many people still think calling out danger is betrayal instead of survival. In the months after the ruling, Mom rearranged life into small, steady things that kept fear from growing roots. We had therapy appointments, school meetings, and check-ins with the guardian ad litem and Detective Rowan. Mornings became predictable. Breakfast, pills, a careful check of my incision, and Emma making sure her backpack had the red card Sophie had given her. The routine was both boring and sacred, and when panic rose, it had fewer places to hide because the day was full of small anchors. Medication on time, a therapist's note, a call to check in. Therapy was slow and honest. Emma learned tools to stop the memories from dragging her into a panic, breathing, grounding, the red card as permission to pause. I sat in my own sessions and learned to name the old rules that had taught me to swallow pain for the sake of appearances. We both learned that surviving doesn't mean you forget, and that the scar on my belly is a map of a night we should have been protected instead of policed. Talking about it made it less sharp but also more real, like cleaning a wound so it can heal. Dad started his mandated counseling and classes, and sometimes in a voice that sounded smaller than I remembered, he admitted he should have listened. Those moments were weirdly hopeful and also raw. He was still the man who had stood by while I begged, but there were cracks where the truth might get in. I didn't trust those cracks to hold everything, but I watched. Therapy can teach people to see their blind spots, but it doesn't force them to care. The court could order classes, but it couldn't force empathy. The scars remained a pale line on my stomach and bruises on my memory, and they remind me daily that survival isn't tidy. There are mornings when I feel guilty for the relief, like we had taken something from the family by choosing to protect ourselves. That guilt is the kind of thing abusers count on. It keeps survivors small. I learned to name that feeling for what it was and not let it decide my steps. Small acts mattered. Mom insisting I rest, Emma drawing quietly while I slept, my therapist telling me that self-preservation is a moral act when others fail you. The record we built was the real reason the judge had to act. Surgeon photos and notes about peritonitis, Emma's 911 timestamp, my journal pages, recordings of Dad trying to shape my words, screenshots of family chats rehearsing lies, and the IT report showing a family tracker on Emma's phone. Those things took a messy family fight and turned it into a clear timeline of danger. Evidence doesn't feel poetic, it's ugly paperwork and timestamps. But it's what makes the difference between a story people can rewrite and a record that keeps kids safe. In our case, documentation was the shield. There's something controversial and true I want to say. Families aren't always safe. That sentence pisses people off because it threatens a myth they hold dear, but hiding behind tradition is how harm repeats. People prefer tidy loyalties to messy truths. We learned that the hard way. Protecting kids sometimes means going against the grain of family solidarity and calling in the boring bureaucracy of paperwork and courtrooms. It's not heroic in a movie way, it's tedious, painful, and necessary. Now, months later, life looks ordinary in small doses. School plays, video games, dinners where laughter creeps back at the edges. Emma carries her red card and sometimes shows it to friends like a private joke. I wear shorts and forget the scar until I see it in the shower and remember how close it was, and how a little girl's quick thinking and a mother's love pulled us from a place we shouldn't have been. The law gave us safety, but the brave, small actions, a bite to free an arm, a whispered address into a phone, a mother who ran to the ER are the real reasons we're here. Those acts and a folder of ugly evidence saved us.